The biggest change to the amount of power that the national government has comes from the powers that were given to Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution. The framers spent a lot of time figuring out what powers Congress should have, and in some of these, their vague choice of wording has allowed interpretation of Congress's role to change over time. So in Article 1, where we're listing the powers of Congress, there are two clauses in there that you absolutely have to know. There's the Commerce Clause and the Elastic Clause. The Commerce Clause says Congress can regulate commerce between the states, and the Elastic Clause is the Necessary and Proper Clause, which says that Congress can make all laws necessary and proper in order to carry out their express powers. The Commerce Clause ends up being the source of most of Congress's power here in the United States in the 2020s. So the words are simple. Congress has the power to regulate commerce between the states. But what does that mean, right? What is commerce between the states? Ultimately, that's going to get decided by the Supreme Court. They're the ones that interpret what the words mean. The real life situation in 2020 is that Congress can get involved in any economic activity as long as it involves more than one state. Here's the thing. We are not going to be able to fund any modern economic activity that only involves one state. Let's think about the simplest kind of business. This is something I'll ask kids every year. What's the simplest kind of business? And we come up with something similar to like a children's lemonade stand. Can Congress regulate a children's lemonade stand? Can Congress step in and tell this child rules about how they sell their lemonade? This seems like a very simple business. Kid makes some lemonade, sells it to whoever walks by. Doesn't seem to involve more than one state, does it? Well, are the kids selling that lemonade to anyone who is a citizen of another state? That's a possibility. If not, let's think about some of the things the kid's using there. Where did they get the lemons? Are we sure that the lemons came from the state that the kid is working in? What about the cups? It's very unlikely that the cups were manufactured nearby where the kid lived. So almost any economic activity is going to end up being interstate commerce. That means that Congress is going to be able to get involved. Congress, if they chose to, has the legal authority to come in there and tell that little kid selling lemonade, first of all, they're violating child labor laws. Second of all, they better be paying their workers a minimum wage. They better not be discriminating against any of the customers that they're serving. They better be following health guidelines when making that lemonade. And so this is this commerce power gives Congress the ability to step in and tell anybody how to do any economic activity. And this is going to be a big source of justification for changes that the government imposes. Without the Commerce Clause, Congress would not have been able to pass things like a minimum wage law. Congress would not be able to pass laws that tell businesses they can't discriminate. Congress would not have been able to end child labor as a practice in the United States. So the Commerce Clause is incredibly important. The wording seems pretty simple. Congress can regulate commerce between the states. It's the Supreme Court's interpretation of these words that have changed the amount of power that Congress has. So let's look at our very first Supreme Court case of the year, Gibbs versus Ogden. A thrilling Supreme Court case about a guy driving a riverboat. You might have dealt with this in U.S. history last year. I'll tell you the story so we can understand the question of the courts. There's this guy, and he drives a boat back and forth between New York and New Jersey. He's letting people get on in New York, get off in New Jersey, get on in New Jersey, get off in New York. Now, he would argue that he's running a very simple business and that this is not trade between the states. But the Supreme Court has to interpret this. The Supreme Court, in looking in the Gibbs versus Ogden case, they say, well, you're picking up people in one state and you're taking them to another state. And the Supreme Court decides that commerce between the states, the words of the Constitution, means that this guy in his steamboat, that's definitely interstate commerce. So they interpret this clause of the Constitution loosely. and that is going to expand the powers of Congress. The result of this Supreme Court decision is huge. Basically, any commerce is interstate commerce. And if any commerce is interstate commerce, any economic activity can be regulated by Congress. Article 1 of the Constitution tells us Congress can regulate interstate commerce. That means Congress can regulate anything that we associate with economic activity. Congress can ban child labor because it's related to commerce. Congress can set wage laws because it's related to commerce. Congress can decide that certain goods are illegal because that's economic activity. All this brings us back to that poor kid trying to run the lemonade stand. That's definitely an economic activity. Therefore, Congress can make whatever rules about that economic activity that they want to, because Article 1 of the Constitution says so in the Commerce Clause. Don't forget the Commerce Clause, one of the most important things in Article 1 of the Constitution. The other big clause in Article 1 that refers to Congress is the necessary and proper clause. Okay, this says Congress can make all laws necessary and proper in order to carry out the express powers. And we're going to call this the elastic clause. Think about elastic. It stretches, right? This clause stretches the powers of Congress. Any power that is written in the Constitution is an express power, and that means that any of these powers can be stretched just a little bit by Congress. And so this is going to give Congress what we call implied powers. They're not written in the Constitution, but they are suggested by the other powers that Congress has. We get another Supreme Court case. This one deals with how to use the elastic clause. So this is another court case you might have heard of, McCulloch versus Maryland. This is dealing with the National Bank. And so the National Bank gets built in the early 1800s. And I know we haven't read every word of the Constitution, but nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the United States can have a bank. This is McCulloch versus Maryland. McCulloch is the guy that runs the bank. Maryland is the state. So McCulloch, as the leader of the Bank of the United States, he's got a bank, and Maryland tries to tax that bank because it's a business operating in their state. This goes all the way to the Supreme Court, because the Bank of the United States is not going to pay a tax from the state of Maryland. Maryland, they argue, should not be able to tax the United States. So it goes to the Supreme Court. And the fight here is about the tax, but the Supreme Court can answer any question that it wants to. It makes up its own mind about these cases. And so the Supreme Court first decides that they're going to deal with the issue of whether or not the United States is even allowed to have a bank. Before they even think about the tax, they're going to decide if the United States can even have a bank. Because if the United States can't have a bank, the tax doesn't matter. Let's think to the elastic clause. The necessary and proper clause says the Congress can do anything necessary and proper to carry out its express powers. Some of those express powers, only Congress can coin money, Congress can borrow money, Congress can spend money, Congress can levy taxes. So Congress sure is dealing with the nation's money. That's obvious. And it sure seems like it would be necessary and proper to establish a national bank in order to help carry out these tasks. And so the Supreme Court decides Congress can establish the national bank. It's not written in the Constitution. Nowhere does it say you can build a bank. But here, because you can tax, coin money, borrow money, spend money, seems like Congress should have the suggested or the implied power to build the national bank. Now that it's clear that Congress can have the bank, we can worry about that tax. You guys are pros on the Constitution now, so you can tell me what Article 6 would say about this. Can a state tax the national government? Article 6 of the Constitution includes the Supremacy Clause, which says the national government is always supreme over states. And so in McCulloch versus Maryland here, the Supreme Court decided two things. First, yes, Congress has implied powers, not just what's written there. The necessary and proper clause gives Congress powers other than what is written in the Constitution. And then the obvious question, of course, Maryland cannot tax this bank. So that's going to give Congress a lot more power, and we call these implied powers. These are the powers that come from the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause. Congress can make the laws that they need to in order to do the things that the Constitution tells them they have to do. Just a couple of examples here. We talked about the bank. They can have a bank because they can tax, coin money, borrow money. One of the things Congress has to do is they must raise an army and a navy. So Congress must build an army and a navy. What if nobody wants to join the army or the navy? Well, that's why many times in history we have held a draft for the military. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say Congress can force you to join the army, but it's Congress's job to build an army, and so it is an implied power that they could hold a draft to help build an army. Congress is also in charge of naturalization laws. That means Congress decides how people become citizens of the United States. They're supposed to be handling immigration to the United States. Well, it doesn't say they can in the Constitution, but if Congress is in charge of immigration law, then it's an implied power that Congress has the ability to limit immigration to the United States, and they've done that many times in the past. So these two clauses are the most important things for you to remember about this whole growth of the federal government. You must remember the Commerce Clause. It gives Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce, which basically means Congress can regulate any kind of economic activity that it wants. And then we have the Elastic Clause, which gives Congress the power to do those things necessary and proper to carry out the jobs that the Constitution gives it. So both of these things really contribute to a big expansion of the powers of the national government from its initial design in the 1780s to where we are now in the 2020s.